In Israel, there were no unique seasons to the harvest. It happened year-round. Olives were harvested between September and November. Flax was harvested between March and April. Barley was harvested between April and May. Wheat was harvested between May and June. Figs and grapes by the end of the summer, somewhere between August and September. So all year round, there was something to be harvested to Israel. And if you think about that as it relates to the gospel, listen, there is no time where there is not an abundance of harvest for you and I. There is no season that we must wait for us to be able to share Christ with others. Do you see that comparison? Here we find ourselves this morning at the culmination now of 3 weeks studying 3 verses. Could you imagine? Did you ever think that's even possible? How do you look at 3 weeks or at 3 verses and come up with something to talk about for 3 weeks? Doesn't seem like it's even doable. And we have found ourselves now in Matthew chapter 9 for the entire month of February. And again, I pray that it has been an encouragement to you. Let me ask you this before we get into our text. Have you caught yourself since the beginning of this month? Have you caught yourself seeing people as Christ saw them? Did it dawn on you at all that is the cause of missions? The cause of missions is people. Did you catch yourself this month, or maybe as the month has gone on, feeling or beginning to feel as Jesus felt? Because while the cause is mission, compassion is in missions, and that's the drive. That's why we do things, because we ought to be compassionate people, not so introverted that we don't see past our own needs. But this morning I want to take that one step further. We need to see as Jesus saw. We need to feel as Jesus felt, but then we have to do as Jesus did. And today we investigate just one more aspect of missions, and that aspect is going to be in regards to our commitment to the mission that God has placed on our shoulders. I want to challenge you this morning to an issue of commitment, committing to being the laborers of the soul harvest that we studied last Sunday. And if you were here last week, I hope for the past 7 days you have come into service this morning, prayed up because you grabbed that card and you placed it in a prominent location. So when you saw it, you would pray that God would use you to reach others for Christ. Commit to being that laborer that God has called us to be. Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. Here's a bit of encouragement. We'll hit an encouraging point right out of the gates. Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. And as you go through the New Testament, you find that theme of reaping and harvesting mentioned multiple times. And so we find the encouragement by Paul in Galatians 6 to stay the course, stay committed to this responsibility and this mission that God has called us to do. And he promises us that in due season we'll reap. Maybe not every time. There's no specification given there, is there, that every time you share the gospel, you will reap the benefits of your labor. You don't find that. Be encouraged a little bit more and understand that even Christ himself didn't bat 1,000. But the encouragement there is not to grow weary and not to faint, to keep working and stay faithful regardless of the amount of time and energy that we've invested into an individual. Why? Because we see people as God saw them. They're souls that will spend somewhere forever. And that moves us to compassion and it drives us to action. So I wanted to give you this morning just 3 things. 3 commitments to reaching Norwood and hopefully the world for Christ, because that's what this is all about. I'm going to throw a little caveat in this. If you didn't come to church today to be challenged to reach people for Christ, I would question why we're here today. Because we are called and commissioned to have eternal impact. So I want you to see verse number 38 in our text. We've been working this direction all month. Sunday mornings, Wednesday nights alike. We get all the way down to verse 38. We spent a lot of time on this last Sunday, so I want to kind of re-emphasize this point and move forward. What are the three commitments to reaching Norwood for Christ? Verse 38, commitment number one, we find in the very first word, we commit to what? Pray. Don't lose sight of that word. Do not glaze over it because we see it so many times and because maybe we do pray faithfully, but don't throw those cards away just because the encouragement to pray has ended. Does that make sense? Grab another one if you need to. Do what you have to do to make sure that prayer is not diminished in your life. But if you notice, as Christ is giving the commission to his disciples, he says, here's what you need to do. He demonstrates it in verse 35 and verse 36. And then he gets to verse 38. Remember, this is the missing step of missions that we talked about last week. We need to be burdened for people. We need to feel compassion towards people. And then we take the leap from compassion straight to doing. And in verse 38, the step is pray. Don't miss that important aspect of missions that we continuously are praying. So let me ask you, don't say it out loud. How did you do this past week? I challenged you. We had tons of people forward last Sunday morning willing to take a card and to pray about your involvement in missions. How'd you do? Not with your commitment to missions yet. How'd you do with your praying this past week? Let me take that a step farther. If you said, I don't know what we would consider successful praying for a week. I have no idea what that would look like. What would be the metric of success to determine whether or not we stuck to our commitment last Sunday? I don't know what that is. But what I do know is this, that we can always pray more for the lost. And that ought not stop just because we said, come this week having prayed. Jesus said, pray in verse 38, pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth laborers into his harvest. So you keep praying. Let me ask you a second question. Did you find yourself this past week at all, as you prayed, and hopefully as you were thinking about the importance of missions and sharing Christ, did you catch yourself at all realizing, I'm starting to see people a little bit different because I've been praying for them? I hope so. If not, maybe we need to go back to last week and cover that yet again, because I don't know what else to do. If we're not willing to pray for people, we're not going to do this step that we're going to talk about today. If we will not take time on our own simply to pray, I'm going to promise you, we're probably not going to go out that back door and proclaim Christ to others. We're not going to do it. So how did you do? In Oswald Chambers' book, My Utmost for His Highest, he said this: the key to the missionary problem is in the hand of God, and that key is prayer. Not work. That is, not work as the world is popularly understood today, because that may mean the evasion of concentration on God. The key is prayer. Naturally, prayer is not practical. Watch this last statement. This is the reason I went with this whole quote this morning. The key is prayer, and naturally prayer is not practical. And look how Chambers describes prayer. It is absurd. We have to realize that prayer is stupid from the ordinary common sense point of view. Now, when is the last time you said, I guarantee you, we all walked out of here last Sunday having studied this topic of prayer thinking that was really stupid, didn't we? Is that our mindset as we walked out of here last Sunday? That was a really absurd time that we spent discussing prayer. What does he mean by that? Where's he getting to? What is that point trying to prove? The idea there is, especially in the world that we live in, we want things now, and we want to know how to do things, right? And so we now, in the beauty of YouTube, those of us that are not skilled to do certain things, simply by watching a video, we can suddenly do them. Isn't that crazy? I can follow step by step. It used to be how-to books, and if you remember the popular series that was out for a while, there's doing things for dummies, right? Anybody can pick up this book and you can speak Spanish or something like that. There's something absurd that probably isn't going to happen overnight. Listen, even in our own home, we had a dryer that kept kicking the bucket on us. I'm not a dryer repairman. I never even thought to call a repairman, but guess what happened? You jump on YouTube and you disassemble the dryer, and there's pieces all over the place, and the drum is sitting in the kitchen in the old house, and Carol would walk in, and I know what she's thinking. This is a disaster. We're going to be buying a new dryer. There's no way you're going to get this thing back together and it's going to work. But by watching a simple YouTube video, it happened and it got fixed, and it lasted a little bit longer and it died again. And you know what the beauty was about YouTube? I always had parts left over I could use somewhere else in the house. Isn't that crazy how that worked? The video not only showed me how to fix the dryer, but here's some spare parts that you might need later on for a future project. That's what we expect in Christianity. And when we think about the idea of prayer, we want to know, how do we get practical? What are the how-to methods? And we're talking about those on Sunday nights in the chapel. How do we talk to people about Christ? How do we engage a culture that is stooped in the Old Testament phrase, every man did that which was right in their own eyes? How do we engage people for the cause of Christ? But those how-tos is not where Christ starts. And that's why Chambers said prayer is absurd and it's basically stupid when it's compared to a common sense point of view. We want to know the practical, and God says, you're leaping over a major step in missions, and that step is spending time in prayer. And so as in unpractical and stupid it may appear, God says the beginning of a revival in the life of a believer begins on his knees. So here's a couple reminders in verse 38. Ready? We didn't talk about these last week, but I want to make these statements and we'll move on. Verse 38, remind yourself as you pray who it is that you're praying to. Do you see that in verse 38? Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest. The Lord, the master, the one who owns the harvest. Remind yourself, who is the harvest? We are referring to those who are unsaved. Remember, the comparison was that as they looked across the fields, they would have seen the harvest, who was indicating their readiness for being harvested, because you saw those white tops across the grain. If you remember, we even made the application last week that for the instance that Jesus was referring to in a later chapter, that going through those fields of grain would have been workers from the city coming out to Christ, because remember, the woman at the well had just gone back into the city, told everybody about this guy that she met at the well, and everybody was coming out to see him. And it wasn't unusual for a city worker to be wearing totally white clothes as a uniform for their job. And so while Jesus, and we might have equated this with an agricultural point of view, Jesus was literally referencing people moving from the city out to where they were dressed head to toe in white garments. And he's saying, those are the people that we're supposed to be going after. The harvest is right before your eyes. Why don't you see that? And so he says what? Look up. Remove the distractions and see people like I see them. And they are so ready for the gospel. And that harvest was created and is owned by God himself. The one that we pray to is the master and the owner of that harvest. So what do we understand? God is the authority over those who need to hear about Christ. But I love this about the authority of God. He never infringes upon man's free will. One's salvation, a person's salvation, is his or her responsibility, but it is our job, it is our commission to share with them Christ and let God do the saving work. So there's the first reminder. Remember who you pray to, the Lord of the harvest. Remember, second of all, there is no lack in the harvest at all. In Israel, there were no unique seasons to the harvest. It happened year-round. Olives were harvested between September and November. Flax was harvested between March and April. Barley was harvested between April and May. Wheat was harvested between May and June. Figs and grapes by the end of the summer, somewhere between August and September. So all year round, there was something to be harvested to Israel. And if you think about that as it relates to the gospel, listen, there is no time where there is not an abundance of harvest for you and I. There is no season that we must wait for us to be able to share Christ with others. Do you see that comparison? Let's take that a little bit practical, since we like that idea from our prayer discussion. We don't have to wait for a church-sanctioned season to be able to share Christ with others. We call this a missions initiative on purpose, chosen specifically to make this point. The initiative must be taken by you and I. Regardless of the season, you don't have to wait. It's a tool. Friend Day, for example, is a tool in our hand to get people around the gospel, and so that we can just love on people. But we do not have to wait until next Sunday to start reaping the harvest for the gospel of Christ. We don't have to wait for the season of another Ashland Loves ministry to be able to talk to people about Christ. Listen, we have these opportunities as simply that. These are chances to reach others for Christ. But if you notice this, there is no lack of harvest year-round. When we go back to the thought about the cityscape behind me, all you have to do is literally get dressed, hopefully brush your teeth, put your shoes on, walk out the door, and you are in a season that is ready to reap. But what's the prayer in verse 38? Nobody wants to do it. There is a ton of work to be done, and there ain't no workers that are willing to go out and do those jobs. Jesus reminds us here that there is no lack in the harvest. We don't have to wait for a more convenient time to share Christ. All right? So remind yourselves, though, the lack is in the harvesters. So our commitment to praying has to become habitual. Literally, maybe we should write this at the bottom of that prayer card we passed out last week. Literally, 1 Thessalonians 5:17 must become the overriding mandate for missions, and that is pray without ceasing. And that card is just supposed to be a reminder for us to do so. So here's the catch. I believe, and this is where things get a little dicey, and we may not like this much. I believe that you and I are the answers to our own prayer. Watch what happens in verse 38. So the instruction, pray. Pray to the Lord of the harvest that He'll send forth laborers. There's plenty to do, not enough workers to go around. And then watch what happens as you kind of get into the next chapter, in chapter number 10. The attention from praying gets shifted now. And in verse number 10, and when He had called unto Him His 12 disciples, He gave them power to do all of these miracles in verse number 10. And then in verse number 5, what happens? These 12 that He mentions between verses 2 and verse 4, Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, now what? Tell me, what's the first words out of Jesus' mouth? Go. Mark that in your Bible. Verse number 38 of chapter 9 is the precursor to a successful verse 5 of chapter 10. Your praying is not just that God would raise up missionaries, whether locally or abroad, out of Ashland. Your prayer is, God, would you raise me up that I would go out and be a missionary for your gospel? Stop praying that God would call other people out of this church and start praying that God would call you out. And here's the beauty of that statement. He already did. You are the answer to your own prayer. You just, listen, you're going to hate me for this. You just spent 7 days praying that God would use you and maybe not even realize it. Isn't that terrible? That's like mind games, isn't it? That's a dirty trick. You just spent a week, hit or miss. That, again, metrics of success aside, you just spent a week praying that God would raise you up to go out and make an impact for Christ, maybe not even realizing it. But is that not what just happened in verse 38? Pray that God would raise up laborers, and then you get into chapter 10. This is so rotten. You get into chapter 10. Here's the list of the names of the laborers, and then he says, okay, the praying is done. Now you gotta go. We got to do this thing. Because sometimes, to be honest with you, as odd as it sounds, sometimes it is okay to stop praying. And at this point in our discussion in Matthew chapter 9 now, working into chapter number 10, as we have now spent 3 weeks hopefully developing eyesight as Christ had, developing compassion as Christ had. Hopefully by now we are almost to the point where we can say, Lord, I don't really need to pray about this a whole lot more. I know what you've called me to do, and it's time to get going. It's verse number 5, the first word, go. The commissioning of the disciples are similar to your and my commissioning. Chapter number 10, verse 1, chapter number 10, verse 5, he tells them to go. But in verse number 1, what do you find? That Jesus gives them the power to go and to do what he's called them to do. Now, I understand that the ministry of the disciples were unique to them. Clearly, because we were not and are not disciples. We've never seen the resurrected Christ, and we have never been part of his earthly ministry. So to call ourselves disciples would be an improper use of the term. So when you look in verse number 1, you see, well, God gave them power to do some pretty crazy miracles. You know why? Because those miracles were always performed in the presence of a Jewish person whom the gospel says time and time again was always looking for signs and wonders. And so Jesus enables them to do these miracles not for their own benefit and for their own worship, but to point those onlookers to Christ who gave them the power. So we have been enabled a little bit differently. What do you find in Acts chapter 1, verse 8? What does the Bible say there for you and I? In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, it says, but you shall receive power. And after that, the Holy Ghost has come upon you, and you shall be witnesses unto me both to Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and to the uttermost part of the earth. Did you catch that? What he did for the disciples, he did for you and I, just a little bit different. But it's the same power. God has called us to a work that he has enabled us to accomplish. And the problem is this, is when there are powerful people who are sitting on their couches, that power has no effect. Why does this even matter? Because while the task of reaching the world for Christ is daunting, it's overwhelming, there are a lot of people to reach. What God has called us to do, he has enabled us to do by his power, even if or when we feel inadequate or unqualified. I'll tell you what, if we were to take a poll, I would imagine one of the major reasons we don't talk to others about God is because we feel inadequate or unqualified. Now, I understand fear might be one of in our discussions on Wednesday night, fear comes up quite a bit. You know why we're afraid? Because we feel inadequate or unqualified. And that causes fear in our lives. And we hesitate to talk to other people about Christ because what if that question arises that I'm not going to know the answer to, then I'm going to feel really out of place. So it'd be better and safer for me just not to talk. Well, 2 problems with that. Number 1, you've already been given the power that you need when the Holy Ghost was put in you the day you were saved. Second of all, we're doing our best to try to conquer that fear by equipping on Sunday nights. And so Adrian Rogers said it this way, the task ahead of us is never as great as the power within us. And so the discussion here is, first of all, it's a distribution of power. You have been enabled to do what you are going to be challenged to commit to. But then there's a declaration of going. Our power enables us to action, right? What else? What would the purpose be to have a power to do something if we were just going to sit and not do anything? Do we do that with anything else in life? Think about the skill sets that God has given you, and think about how you might have used those in your job field. I mean, it would be like a doctor having the skills of performing surgery and deciding, I'm not going to the hospital today. I have the power to heal people, yet I'd rather not do anything. I'd rather not use that enabling that I have been given and all those years of training that I have been given to perform this surgery. I'm just not doing it today. I'm not feeling it. And the problem with that is we have a ministry that impacts eternity. We've been enabled to. We might be uncomfortable with it. But the problem with this is we have been told to go, and God has enabled us to go. And yet our attitude might be, I'm not doing it. I don't know that we have the boldness to say those specific words verbatim to God. Lord, I'm not doing this. I don't think we say that. But sometimes what we teach our kids are very true, that our actions speak louder than our words. And in this case, our lack of action speaks louder than our words. Our power that has been given to us drives us to action. And I want you to do this. Go with me, because you can't talk missions without going to Matthew 28. So would you flip over there with me and look at a couple verses? Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. So Acts chapter 1, we have been given the power. We are called to be witnesses. And here's another reiteration of this fact. Matthew 28, verse 19, the beginning of what we have dubbed the Great Commission begins what? Go ye therefore. But did you notice verse 18? Did I get there too quick? Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. And Jesus came and spake unto them, saying, all power is given unto me. And in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, he then distributes that power to you and I. So the enabling is there for verse 19, for us to go. Listen to me. God doesn't have us praying, and God doesn't give us power so that we can be passive. Put it on the screen. I think I've lost everyone already. Amen. Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. Hey, her voice wasn't even working before service, and she had that one out. Church, listen to me. God doesn't ask us to pray, and He does not give us the power for us to become passive with the gospel of Christ. Go ye therefore, to journey, to travel, to walk, to go where? To go out into the mess of the world, so that our commitment is not just to see and to feel like Christ, but so that we can go and do something about it, to do as Christ did. All right, so keep your finger in Matthew chapter 28 and go back to Matthew chapter 10 with me. Remember Matthew chapter 9, verse 38, pray. Chapter 10, verse 5, go. And then here's the action point. Matthew chapter 10, verse number 7. He says this, and as ye go, here's the last thought for the morning. What do? You preach. I mean, do we need any simpler list of ingredients to reaching the world with the gospel other than Matthew 9, verse 38 down to chapter 10, verse 7? Pray, go, preach. I could have saved us a lot of time and had us recite those words, and we've been done, right? Pray, go, preach. Proclaim. Share. I want you to think about this real quick. We have to have a point where we commit to Matthew chapter 10, verse number 7. And as ye go, you preach. That is our individual mandate. Go and proclaim. The verb go is what we call in English, apparently, a present participle. It can be understood as a continuous action. We go and we keep on going. This is not a one and done scenario where we go and we pat ourselves on the back feeling accomplished as Christians and I've done my part. No, this is a go and I keep on going until either God calls me home or the Lord comes back, whichever one happens first. I don't stop. You and I cannot wait for the unsaved world to come and knock on our doors in anticipation of learning when our calling and God's will for us is to go and to proclaim. Here, let's do an exercise real quick, okay? I'm going to practice this with you. Ready? God has called us to share the gospel with others, and so let's do this. You with me? It's working, right? I've got the power. I've got the message to do it. You get the point? Not doing a whole lot, am I? But I'm in church. Awesome. We're happy you are. No better place to be on a Sunday morning than right here in church. It's not our commission. Our commission is to go and to proclaim. And as I've sat here, I didn't see anybody come running up begging to hear the gospel. You're going to be waiting a long time. The commission is to go and to proclaim. So think about this. We can't wait for them to come to us. The Bible says to go and to proclaim. So our calling and God's will for each of us individually is to be involved in this commitment. So to help us to become a little forward thinking and to prove my point just a little bit further, instead of just sitting on a step waiting for people to come to us needing to be saved and needing to know how their sins can be forgiven and they're on their way to heaven, a group of us got together, we sat down with the deacons and we became a little bit forward thinking. And we decided that to be able to more successfully commit to proclaiming the gospel, we're going to create a major citywide event in about 64 months from now. July of 2025. We are going to majorly focus on evangelism on that date. We haven't nailed it down just yet. We'll see what the calendar looks like, but just stick with me. For 64 months, 5 years and 4 months from now, in July of 2025, we're going to reach our city and we're going to see impact. And how are we going to do it? We're going to get other like-minded churches together in Cincinnati to join us in this effort. We project the cost will be around $100 million. We'll bring in some of the greatest worship leaders, keynote speakers, someone much better than I to come in and speak and be able to communicate the gospel well. We're going to advertise the absolute fire out of this thing so that there's no one in Cincinnati that does not know this is coming. What if we did this? And I am speaking hypothetically, so don't panic. What if we did this, and at the end of this event in 64 months, we saw 5,000 people accept the message of the gospel and get saved? 5,000. Success? Success? Yes. My goodness, yes. Absolutely. You know what we would say? Because we're a little old-fashioned in this area, we'd say, bless God, if one soul got saved, it was worth it, right? Right? 5,000? Oh my goodness, that's a lot of blessed gods. We'll be here for a while. Wait. What if we change the strategy up just a little bit? Same 64 months, same goal of reaching people for Christ, but watch. What happens if in the first month, one person in this room reached 2 people for Christ and they trusted Christ as their Savior and they got saved? Just one person. I don't know how many people is here today. Just one of us. At the end of that month, how many people would be saved? Counting the one person, there'd be 3. You following the math? 2, 1, 3. Okay. Second month, those 2 new Christians did the same thing. Those 2 new Christians went out and each one of them reached 2 people themselves. And they got saved. They had their sins forgiven. They trusted Christ as their Savior. Now how many people do you have saved? Okay. Third month. Those 4 new Christians each go out and introduce 2 people to Christ, and they get saved. What if that pattern continued for the next 61 months? You think it'd be a successful effort? What if that continued for 64 months? Would that be a successful strategy? I'll tell you already, it'd be successful. It'd be a lot easier on the budget too, by the way. But it would be successful for sure. Because a lot of it, first of all, depends on how you define success. Strategy 1 produced 5,000 souls, to which all of us agreed was a success. However, if we would simply understand the power of one person sharing Christ, option number 1 would be cleared off the table immediately. Because option number 2, where one person buys into the mission of reaching 2 people, and that domino effect of gospel fire being spread was caught on, you know how many would be reached after 64 months. Watch this, and I wrote it down in words so I would say it right. In 64 months, 9 quintillion, 223 quadrillion, 372 trillion, 36 billion, 854 million, 720,000 people would come to know Christ in 64 months if one of us would reach 2 people, and then those 2 people would reach 2 people, and those 4 would reach 2 more. We would reach the world, and our commission would be over many times over. Would that be successful? Option 1 doesn't look so good no more, does it? You know what this boils down to? Commitment. You know what the problem with this is? The problem isn't the gospel. The problem isn't the unsaved world. The problem is you and I. That number on that screen that barely fits on a PowerPoint slide drastically drops when you and I refuse to admit that God has enabled us and commissioned us to reach a world for Christ. We're just not going to do it. Not committed. Well, I'll come to church. There's going to be some good food. Sunday school class is a great time. We'll sit through a preaching, however you described it. We'll sit through the preaching. We'll go to lunch afterward. But daggone it, we're not willing to see 9 quintillion people trust Christ because we don't buy into the idea that one person makes a difference. Every one of us in this room. I know a lot of people are going to be watching this, hopefully in our archives. So one person who watches this video and understands that if they just reach 2 people for Christ, and then we disciple those people to reach out more, look, that's just over 5 years. Isn't that a crazy thought? We defined on one of our discussion nights on Wednesday night, one of the major reasons we don't buy into our mission that God has given to us. Because honestly, we're just too busy. Life becomes consumed with me. I don't see people as Jesus saw people. I don't buy into the cause of missions, which is people. I don't feel as Jesus felt. I don't buy into the compassion of missions being the propellant. I don't do as Jesus did because I am simply too busy to pray and too busy to proclaim. And I share with you this story, and this is going to be our closing illustration. Those of you that were here a couple weeks ago, this is going to sound familiar, but I could not get away from it. It's a true story. John Darley and Daniel Batson decided to replicate the story of the Good Samaritan with seminary students, preacher boys, guys called into ministry. To introduce the Good Samaritan with this replication, they added a few variables. The seminarians, the students, were interviewed and asked why it was they wanted to go into ministry, and the overwhelming answer was because we want to make a difference in the lives of people. We want to help people. They were then asked after that interview to prepare a short sermon. Half of them were supposed to prepare a sermon on the story of the Good Samaritan, the other half of them on different topics. Finally, they were told to go over to a building where they were to present their sermons. And here's where the test came in. Along the way between the buildings on campus, the researchers had strategically positioned an actor back into an alley to play the part of the man who was mugged in Jesus' story. He was hunched over and groaning loud enough for anybody that was passing by to be able to hear what was going on. And the researchers hypothesized that those people that were going into ministry to help people and those who had just prepared a message on the Good Samaritan would be most likely to stop and to help. Makes sense, right? Their calling and their studies are unified together, should change them. But as they watched this play out before their eyes, it wasn't the case. And the reason is the final variable that was introduced by the researchers just before the seminarians left that building to go present their message on the passage of the Good Samaritan. The researcher looked at his watch and he said one of two things. You ready? To some of the seminarians, the researcher said, "You're late. They're expecting you. You better be in a hurry and get over there in a few minutes to present your message." To others, the researcher said, "You're early. They're not expecting you for a few minutes, but go ahead and start heading over there." So you see the sense of urgency between the two people groups. Are you still focused in on this? Because what were the results? Remember, part of the group said, "You're late, get over there quick." Another part said, "You have plenty of time, you're early, take your time to start heading that way." As they passed by the actor, pretending to be the one mugged and groaning and in pain, only 10% of the seminary students who were in a hurry stopped to help, while 63% of those who were not in a hurry stopped to help. In several cases, a seminary student going to go give his talk on the parable of the Good Samaritan literally stepped over the actor because he was in such a hurry to go preach on meeting needs for the cause of Christ. I laugh and it's really not funny. Darley and Batson concluded that it didn't matter whether someone wanted to help people or whether someone had just read and was prepared to preach on the parable of the Good Samaritan. The only thing that mattered was whether or not they were in a hurry. The researchers concluded that 2 words had the effect of making someone who is ordinarily compassionate into someone who is indifferent to suffering. Do you know what those 2 words were? You're late. Literally hurtling over someone who needed help to go present a message, to fulfill their calling to compassion. They missed the point. Now, we handed out a card last week, and I want you to keep those cards and continue to pray, not just that God would raise up laborers, but the men are going to bring forward, and at this point, one more token of our missions conference, our missions initiative that I want you to get. 2 words made the difference in whether or not they were going to be individually involved in helping others demonstrate the love and the compassion of Christ. 2 words got in the way of what could have been eternal impact, and they missed it because they were in a hurry. I want every one of you to get one of these wristbands. Everyone, I don't care if you go to church here or not. It does not matter to me at all. There's plenty. When every one of you, and if you're not I don't call them bracelets because wristbands sound much manlier. But I want you to get one of these, okay? Because I want you to see this. And may this be a tool in our hand every stinking day of our lives. And on this wristband has the church's logo to remind you of this message. And it has 3 words that I want to override the 2 words in your mind that's going to cause you to potentially miss opportunity to demonstrate compassion. And these 3 words inscribed on this band, you have time. You know what's amazing about that statement is? It's very true. We have time for the things that we want time for. Do we not? I have time to do the work around the house that I needed to get done. I had time to get up early and get to work. I had time to go out and get a bite to eat. I had time to go watch that game. I have time, and I make time to do what it is that I want to do. But remember, in our very beginning discussion, it is me that gets in the way of the mission. And church, listen to me. Wear these bands. Even if you're not a wristband wearer, wear this crazy band and remind yourself when you're about to hurdle over someone who you can be used to show the love and compassion of Christ. Glimpse down at that band and remind yourself you have time. Because you do. We all have the same 168 hours in the week. You have time. Individually. To be part of the effort of reaching 9 quintillion people. We have time to do what we want. But we don't have time to do what needs to be done. You know, I think it would be cool too is if somebody glimpsed down at that bracelet and says, what in the world does that mean to you? These silicone bracelets have become synonymous with causes. People that are hurting, and we remind ourselves to pray for or to spread the word about someone who is in need. What greater cause and what greater need than to wear a wristband reminding us to be involved in the cause of missions? Maybe somebody could look down at your wrist and say, you have time for what? Listen, if somebody does that to you, you better sit down for a minute and realize God's given you the time and He's given you the open door to talk to somebody about what in the world that means. It's a personal reminder for you and I, and it's a tool for evangelism to the world that we're about to walk into. It all boils down to this. It's an issue of commitment, folks. It all boils down to individual responsibility to talk to others about Christ. Are we in? Oh, don't answer that out loud. Careful with that. I'm going to call you to commit in just a minute, not to me. It's none of my business. But you're going to be challenged to commit to missions through personal proclamation of the gospel. So in a minute when I say, are we in? This is a commitment you're making between yourself and God. This is not a church growth strategy, could not care less. This is a kingdom growth strategy where we are involved in sharing Christ with others personally.